In the dying light of a broken world, a new fire was born. As the Byzantine Empire staggered in the east and Christian crusaders bled the land in the west, a small frontier tribe on the edges of Anatolia planted a banner, simple, black, unshaken. From that soil rose a dynasty that would last 6 centuries. It would bring down cities older than Christ, shake the gates of Vienna, and rule across 3 continents. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, of how a handful of warriors became the masters of Islam and the nightmare of Christian Europe. The year was 1299. In the borderlands between the Byzantine Empire and the crumbling Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, a small tribe led by a chieftain named Osman declared independence. Osman Ghazi was not born into royalty, he was born into war. His people, the Turks, were nomads, hard, fast, devout. Raised on horseback, guided by the Quran, and hardened by raids against Byzantines and rival tribes. Osman believed in something greater, a new order, a state rooted in Islam, ruled by justice and expanded by conquest. And so the Ottoman Beylik was born, named after him. It was small, dirt roads, wood fortresses, scattered warriors, but it had something empires had lost: hunger. The Ottomans didn't fight with mighty armies. They fought with momentum. Osman's son Orhan expanded east and west. The town of Bursa fell in 1326, becoming the first true Ottoman capital. By the mid-1300s, the Ottomans were no longer just raiders. They were rulers. They established a court, a treasury, a standing army. And they brought with them something new, the Ghazi ideal, the sacred warrior fighting for Islam. In Europe, they were seen as a plague, an unstoppable wave from the east. In the Muslim world, they were hailed as defenders of the faith. They crossed into Europe in 1354 through the Dardanelles, establishing a foothold in Gallipoli, land that would echo with blood for centuries to come. The Ottomans adapted fast. They recruited local Christians. They learned siege tactics. Most shockingly, they introduced a military innovation Europe had never seen: the Janissaries. Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, converted, and trained into an elite force of rifle-bearing infantry, utterly loyal to the Sultan. Europe watched in horror as these boys, once altar servers and shepherds, returned in Ottoman armor, speaking Turkish, praying in Arabic, and fighting against the kingdoms of their birth. No one had ever built an army like this. In 1389, the Ottomans faced Serbia at the Battle of Kosovo. The Christian world hoped to stop them, but the Ottomans stood firm. Both leaders died, but the field was claimed by Islam. The Balkans trembled. 1451, a 19-year-old sultan named Mehmed II ascends the throne. His ambition? Take the city that no one could touch for 1,000 years, Constantinople. The capital of Byzantium, the city of Constantine, the last light of the Eastern Roman Empire. It stood tall, walled, defiant, and forgotten by its western cousins. Mehmed brought an army of 80,000 men, and a cannon so large it needed 60 oxen to move. He dragged his ships across land. He offered peace. The emperor refused. On May 29, 1453, the walls finally cracked. The city was taken. Churches turned to mosques. The world changed. Constantinople was reborn as Istanbul. The Roman Empire had finally fallen, not by Goths or Vikings, but by a young sultan from Anatolia. With Constantinople captured, the Ottomans became more than conquerors. They became an empire. One foot in Europe, one in Asia. They would now challenge popes, emperors, and kings. Their shadow would stretch from Budapest to Baghdad, and under one man, Suleiman the Magnificent, they would rise to a height unmatched in Islamic history. The age of expansion was over. The age of empire had begun. In the dying years of the 13th century, as Christendom looked westward and Byzantium limped through its final chapters, a new flame sparked in the east. Not from an empire, not from a palace, but from the rugged hills of Anatolia, where nomads whispered prayers into the cold wind and dreamed of something greater. This flame was called Osman. Osman was born into the Kaya tribe, a branch of Oghuz Turks, who had fled the Mongols and settled near the Byzantine frontier. His father, Ertugrul, had pledged loyalty to the Seljuk Sultanate, but that sultanate was dying. Osman saw opportunity in the power vacuum, not to serve, but to rule. Around the year 1299, Osman declared independence. No fanfare, no coronation, just a bold claim and a sharpened sword. He launched raids into Byzantine lands, winning battles and loyalty. His warriors, known as Ghazis, holy fighters, believed they were on a mission not just for land, but for Islam. The early Ottoman state had no gold, no bureaucracy, no standing army. What it had was momentum and belief. Osman captured the town of Yenishehir, making it his first capital. He minted coins in his name, a symbol of sovereignty. A state was born not from bloodlines but from fire. When Osman died in 1326, his son Orhan took the reins. Under him, the Ottomans moved from tribal leaders to imperial builders. The first major victory came with the capture of Bursa, a key Byzantine stronghold in northwest Anatolia. Bursa became the empire's new capital, not a camp but a city. Orhan built mosques, madrasas, markets, laying the spiritual and economic foundations of what was no longer a beylik, but a blooming empire. Then came the crossing. In 1354, an earthquake weakened the walls of Gallipoli. Ottoman forces already camped nearby swept in and seized the town. For the first time, Turks set foot in Europe. The Byzantine Empire, once the Roman rock of the East, had unknowingly opened the gates to its doom. Orhan's successors, particularly Murad I, continued the expansion. They marched through the Balkans, Thrace, Macedonia, Bulgaria. In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, the Ottomans met a Serbian-led Christian coalition. Both Murad and the Serbian prince would die that day, but the battle secured Ottoman dominance in the region. The crescent moon had pierced the heart of Europe. As their territory grew, so did the need for a more disciplined army. The Ottomans introduced one of the most controversial institutions in military history, the devshirme system. Christian boys, taken from Balkan villages, were converted to Islam, educated, and trained to fight, not as slaves, but as elite soldiers, the Janissaries. Loyal only to the Sultan, forbidden to marry and bound by strict codes, these boys were forged into an unstoppable force. Armed with matchlocks and sabers, they would later become the terror of Vienna, the shield of Istanbul, and the symbol of Ottoman might. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans encircled Constantinople. The once great capital of the Eastern Roman Empire had become a fading relic, isolated, weakened, abandoned by the West. But its walls still stood, tall, proud. Then came Mehmed A, a 19-year-old sultan with a vision that terrified his advisors. He would take the city, at any cost. In 1451, Mehmed returned to the throne with unmatched focus. He gathered an army of over 80,000 soldiers, built a navy, and commissioned a cannon so massive it shook the earth. It took 3 hours to reload, and it would bring the walls down. On April 6, 1453, the siege began. The Byzantines were outnumbered, 7,000 defenders against an Ottoman war machine. Mehmed ordered his ships dragged over land around the Golden Horn, bypassing the iron chains blocking the harbor. The city was now fully surrounded. After 53 days, on May 29, the walls cracked. The Ottomans poured in. The final Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died sword in hand, becoming legend in both East and West. Hagia Sophia, once the greatest cathedral of Christendom, echoed with the first Islamic prayer. Constantinople was reborn as Istanbul, the jewel of the Ottoman crown. Mehmed entered the city not as a butcher but as a builder. He declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. He restored water, reopened markets, protected Christians and Jews, and called artisans from across the empire to breathe life into the ruins. Istanbul was now the capital of a vast and growing empire, and Mehmed was no longer a frontier Ghazi. He was a sultan of sultans. The Ottoman Empire had stepped into history as a true successor to Rome and a new nightmare for Europe. From the wilds of Anatolia to the throne of Constantine, the Ottomans had achieved what no other had done in 1,000 years. The eastern half of the Roman world had finally fallen, not to Latin crusaders nor Mongol hordes, but to a Muslim boy who had dreamed of greatness. But this was only the beginning. The year was 1520. The city of Istanbul awoke to the sound of drums. Sultan Selim I, the fierce, conquering lion of the East, was dead. His 26-year-old son, Suleiman, now sat on the throne. Few expected greatness. He was known as a poet, not a warrior, a thinker, not a storm. But within weeks the world would realize the lion's air carried fire in his veins. His reign would stretch over 4 decades, expanding the empire to its zenith. Europe would kneel, Asia would burn, Africa would yield. This is the age of Suleiman the Magnificent, the golden age before the cracks appeared. Suleiman inherited more than just a throne. He inherited a rising world power. His father had conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, bringing Mecca, Medina, and Cairo under Ottoman rule. But Suleiman had something Selim lacked: vision. Not just a conqueror, but a lawgiver, a builder, a philosopher-king. He began by reforming law, strengthening trade, and enhancing the Janissary corps. But Europe beckoned. In 1521, he turned his eyes to Belgrade, a Christian stronghold in Hungary. The city fell, quickly, brutally. Then came Rhodes, held by the formidable Knights Hospitaller. After a long siege, the knights surrendered. Suleiman granted them safe passage. This wasn't just war, it was theater, power wrapped in mercy, and the world began to watch. In 1526, Suleiman led his army against the Kingdom of Hungary. The target, Mohacs. The Hungarian king, Louis II, stood with 25,000 men. The Ottomans came with over 60,000. On August 29, the fields turned red. The Hungarians were annihilated. Louis drowned in retreat. Within hours, the kingdom was leaderless. It was one of the most devastating defeats in European history. Suleiman marched into Buda unopposed. Central Europe was now under Ottoman shadow. In 1529, emboldened by success, Suleiman made a bold gamble. He would march on Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg dynasty. The city represented Christian resistance in Europe. If Vienna fell, the road to Germany would lie open. But nature turned. Torrential rains bogged down the army. Cannons sank in mud. Supplies spoiled. When the siege began, Vienna stood firm. After weeks of bitter fighting, Suleiman withdrew. It was his first true failure. The empire would never again push so deep into Western Europe. Yet in the Muslim world, his legend only grew. To his subjects, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver. To Europe, Suleiman the Magnificent. Two names, two worlds, one empire. While armies conquered, Suleiman built a civilization. Under his rule, Istanbul became the center of Islamic art, science, and architecture. The empire's legal code was codified. Poets like Baki, architects like Sinan, scholars, astronomers, doctors, they all thrived. Mimar Sinan, a former Janissary and Christian convert, became the empire's chief architect. He built hundreds of mosques, bridges, aqueducts. His greatest gift to the Sultan? The Suleimani Mosque, a masterpiece rivaling any cathedral in Europe. Suleiman himself was a poet. His verses spoke of divine love, longing, and power. He saw empire not just as territory, but as a stage for beauty. Trade flowed across 3 continents. Turkish coffee, Persian carpets, Venetian glass, all met under the domes of Ottoman bazaars. This was not just a golden age for Muslims. It was a jewel in the crown of human history. But even in golden empires, hearts stir rebellion. Suleiman's greatest love was not a princess or noble, but a slave girl from Ruthenia. Her name was Roxlana, later known as Hurrem Sultan. She rose through the harem, became his legal wife, a scandal in the court, and wielded enormous influence. Hurrem was brilliant. She corresponded with foreign monarchs, built charitable complexes, and shaped court politics. But her presence sparked controversy, especially over succession. Suleiman's trusted son, Mustafa, popular among the army, was accused, perhaps falsely, of plotting rebellion. In 1553, Suleiman ordered Mustafa's execution. The act haunted the Sultan and shook the empire's foundations. Even as the empire stretched from Algeria to Azerbaijan, the seeds of decline had been sown. Power began to centralize around the palace. The devshirme system weakened. Corruption crept in. The Janissaries, once elite, became bloated and political. The bureaucracy expanded but became inefficient. Foreign wars drained the treasury, and under the surface, ethnic and religious divisions, once contained, began to stir. In 1566, at the age of 71, Suleiman rode into one final campaign against the fortress of Szigetvar in Hungary. It was a battle he didn't need to fight, but perhaps the Sultan, sensing time slipping away, longed for one last moment of fire. As the siege wore on, Suleiman fell ill. He died in his tent, but his death was kept secret for weeks. His heart was buried near the battlefield, his body taken back to Istanbul, where his mosque awaited him, where history would seal his name. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached its greatest height, militarily, politically, culturally. He ruled over 25 million people, from Hungary to Yemen. His laws shaped society for centuries. His buildings still stand, his verses still echo. Even as the domes gleamed in the sun, the empire began to drift. Future sultans would lack his brilliance. The cracks, once hidden, would widen. Suleiman's death was not the fall of the empire, but it was the end of its soul. The golden age had passed. What came next was survival, struggle, and slow, beautiful decline. By the end of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stood as the master of 3 continents. Its armies had crushed empires. Its banners fluttered from Baghdad to Budapest. But Europe was changing, faster, smarter, unified. The long peace between East and West was shattered, replaced by sieges, betrayal, and brutal war. The Ottomans would now face their greatest enemy, a united Europe. The first great struggle erupted in 1593 as tensions with the Habsburgs of Austria boiled over. For over a century, the Ottomans had held Hungary. But revolts festered, Christian princes plotted, and Europe saw a moment of weakness. The war began badly. Ottoman forces suffered defeats in Hungary. At Sisak, 20,000 Ottoman troops were crushed by Croatian and Austrian defenders. The empire's myth of invincibility began to crack. The war dragged on for 13 bitter years. The winter of 1595 was particularly cruel. Janissaries mutinied for lack of food. Meanwhile, the Austrians, funded by the Pope and Venice, gained ground. Finally, in 1606, the Treaty of Sint-Viatorok was signed. It marked the first time the Sultan treated a European ruler as an equal, not a vassal. It was more than a diplomatic shift. It was a blow to Ottoman pride. But the greatest moment of confrontation came almost a century later. The Ottomans once again marched toward the heart of Europe. Their target, Vienna. The year was 1683. At the head of over 150,000 men, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led the might of the empire into Austria. His goal, not just victory, but domination. Vienna was surrounded, bombarded, nearly broken. Panic spread across Christian Europe. But then came salvation. On September 12th, the gates of heaven, or hell, swung open. King Jan Sobieski of Poland, leading a relief force of 70,000, charged down from the hills. It was one of the largest cavalry charges in history. The Ottoman lines shattered. Kara Mustafa fled, only to be executed by silk cord on the Sultan's orders. The siege of Vienna was over, and so too was the Ottoman dream of conquering Europe. Vienna's rescue was just the beginning. The Holy League, a powerful alliance of Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, launched a counteroffensive. The Ottomans were pushed back across Hungary. City after city fell. Buda, Pest, Novi Sad, Transylvania. By 1697, the empire was bleeding. At the Battle of Zenta, the Ottomans attempted to cross the Tisa River, but Austrian forces under Prince Eugene of Savoy struck like lightning. In a matter of hours, 20,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed. It was a massacre. The war ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699. The Ottomans ceded Hungary, Transylvania, and more. For the first time in history, the empire lost major European territory. The invincible had been humbled. While armies fought on land, another war raged at sea. The Venetian Republic, once the queen of the Adriatic, was a long-time Ottoman rival. Crete, held by Venice for centuries, fell to the Ottomans in 1669 after a brutal 24-year siege. But the war wasn't over. In the Marian War, 1684 through 1699, Venice struck back, this time reclaiming parts of Greece, including the Peloponnese. The fighting was vicious. Towns changed hands multiple times. Civilian suffering was immense. Mass deportations, burned villages, forced conversions. Though Venice never regained its former dominance, it proved the Ottomans could be challenged and defeated at sea. As Europe modernized, a new power emerged in the north, Russia. Under Peter the Great, the Tsars no longer feared the Ottoman threat. They hungered for warm water ports and southern glory. The Russo-Turkish Wars began in earnest in the 17th century. In 1711, Russia invaded Ottoman Moldavia, but was surrounded at the Pruth River. The Ottomans forced them into peace, but this would not last. As decades passed, Russia grew stronger, and the Ottomans, facing rebellions, debt, and internal decay, grew weaker. By the late 18th century, the balance had flipped. Ottoman lands in Crimea and the Black Sea fell to Russian expansion. Catherine the Great humiliated the Ottoman navy. Crimea, once a Muslim stronghold, was annexed, a dagger to the heart of Ottoman pride. While the Ottomans clung to tradition, Europe moved forward. The Enlightenment birthed revolutions, science replaced superstition, gunpowder empires gave way to industrial ones, the Ottoman court resisted reform, printing presses were banned, European embassies were mocked, the sultans believed Allah would preserve the empire, as he always had. But destiny does not wait. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer feared, but pitied. In London, they called it the sick man of Europe, and vultures began to circle. The wars with Europe had cost the Ottomans hundreds of thousands of lives, shattered cities, and irreparable prestige. For every fortress taken, 3 were lost. For every treaty signed, another insult was swallowed. This was no longer a rising empire. It was a mighty river, flowing backward, bleeding slowly, under pressure from a world that had outgrown it. Once a titan that shook continents, the Ottoman Empire now drifted through the centuries like a wounded giant. Its golden age was over, its enemies sharper. But the real enemy now came from within. Corruption rotted the palace. Stagnation choked innovation. And across its many provinces, a new fire smoldered: nationalism. This is the story of decline, not with a scream, but a slow, suffocating silence. In the aftermath of military defeat, the Ottoman palace became a place of fear, not vision. Sultans grew weaker. Some were children, others puppets. Decision-making slipped from the throne to the hands of viziers, eunuchs, and harem politics. The 17th and 18th centuries saw sultans like Ibrahim the Mad, who drowned in indulgence, and Mustafa I, who muttered to himself in the garden. These were not emperors of legend. They were symptoms of a dying order. Ministers sold offices to the highest bidder. Corruption ran through the courts like a river. Positions once earned by merit were now bought. Loyalty faded. Only profit mattered. Once the empire's elite military corps, the janissaries had become corrupt and bloated. No longer warriors, they were landlords, thugs, and political kingmakers. They resisted modernization, opposed reforms, and worse, they refused to fight. In war after war, they mutinied, fled, or even revolted. Attempts to dissolve them ended in disaster. In 1807, Sultan Selim III tried to replace them. The janissaries responded by revolting and strangling him to death. The army was now a threat not to the enemy, but to the Sultan himself. As war crippled the empire, the economy began to crumble. Once self-sufficient, the empire now depended on European loans. Capitulations, trade agreements meant to boost commerce, allowed European powers to dominate Ottoman markets. British textiles, French goods, and Austrian metals flooded in. Local industries collapsed. By the 1800s, the empire was bankrupt. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, controlled by Europe, now handled the Sultan's money. It was colonialism in all but name. But perhaps the deadliest crack came not from bullets or debt, but identity. The empire's strength had once been its diversity, but now people no longer saw themselves as Ottoman. Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, Armenians, inspired by European nationalism and romanticism, began to ask, why should we serve an empire that does not serve us? In 1804, the first Serbian uprising erupted. It was followed by more in 1815, 1821, 1876. Greece, once the jewel of classical civilization, rose in 1821. The war was brutal. Cities burned, villages slaughtered, but by 1830, Greece became independent. It was the first domino. Every province that rose inspired another. The empire could no longer hold its peoples together. Only force and fear remained. Faced with chaos, the Ottomans launched the Tanzimat reforms, a sweeping attempt to modernize the empire. Inspired by the West, they promised equality, education, infrastructure, and legal reform. The Edict of Gulhane, 1839, and the Islahat Edict, 1856, aimed to give non-Muslims more rights. Railways were built, postal systems introduced, the army modernized, Western dress adopted, a constitution drafted. But the reforms angered everyone. Conservatives saw it as betrayal of Islam, nationalists saw it as too little too late, and the bureaucracy, already corrupt, swallowed the money. The Tanzimat reforms were bold, but reform cannot save a body already riddled with rot. As the empire weakened, Europe debated a single question: who gets the Ottoman corpse? It was called the Eastern Question. Russia eyed the Balkans. Austria wanted Bosnia. Britain protected routes to India. France craved North Africa. Every power pretended to protect Ottoman minorities while sharpening their knives. In 1853, the Crimean War erupted. Russia versus the Ottomans, Britain and France. The Ottomans technically won, but they needed Western help to do it. The victory only highlighted how weak they had become. In 1876, a revolt erupted in Bulgaria. Ottoman forces crushed it with horrifying brutality. Entire villages were massacred. The West was outraged. Newspapers across Britain, France, and Russia exploded with condemnation. William Gladstone, British politician, wrote, "Let the Turks now carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, with the sword." The empire had lost the moral high ground. It was no longer seen as a guardian of order, but a butcher of freedom. By the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire still existed on the map, but it was not the empire of Suleiman. It was a relic, outpaced, outthought, surrounded. Corruption gnawed from the inside, nationalism tore from the edges, and Europe stood ready to deliver the final blow. The next century would bring more wars, more revolts, and finally, total collapse. But in this moment, the empire still breathed. Not living, not dead, just dying slowly. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer feared. It was watched. In European capitals, diplomats whispered the same phrase, "the sick man of Europe." Once mighty empire, now gasping under its own weight, defeated in war, humiliated in diplomacy, torn apart by revolt. The 1800s would be a century of slow bleeding, and the world watched as the Ottomans limped toward history's graveyard. The first great blow came not from the East, but the West. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, the empire's richest province. The Ottomans, paralyzed and disorganized, could do little. The French swept through Cairo. The Mamluks were destroyed. Only British intervention forced Napoleon to withdraw. But the damage was done. The world now saw it clearly. The Ottomans could no longer defend their own empire. In the power vacuum left behind, a new ruler rose, Muhammad Ali of Egypt. Though nominally under Ottoman rule, he built his own army, his own navy, his own empire. He reformed agriculture, modernized education, and industrialized Egypt. He was everything the Ottomans were not. In 1831, he invaded Syria and Anatolia, defeating Ottoman forces repeatedly. Only European diplomacy saved the Sultan from total defeat. By 1841, Egypt was autonomous in all but name. The empire's greatest province was lost, not to rebels or invaders, but to progress it could not match. In the 1820s, revolution erupted again, this time in Greece. Fueled by nationalism and romanticism, the Greeks rose to reclaim their ancient homeland. Ottoman retaliation was brutal. Entire towns were wiped out. The Chios massacre shocked Europe, but instead of crushing resistance, the violence drew in global sympathy.
Britain, France, and Russia intervened.
At the Battle of Navarino, 1827, they sank the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. Greece gained independence in 1830. The empire lost not just a province, but the illusion of invincibility. Greece's success inspired others. In Serbia, a series of uprisings from 1804 to 1835 led to autonomy. In Montenegro, Albania, and Bosnia, rebellion simmered constantly. In Bulgaria, nationalism was rising fast, hidden in monasteries, whispered in schools. Language, folklore, identity, these became weapons. The empire responded with force, but it was always one step behind. The fire of nationalism could no longer be drowned in blood. Desperate to survive, the Ottomans began to change. From 1839 to 1876, they introduced sweeping reforms called the Tanzimat. New laws, equal rights for minorities, modern armies, Western-style schools, these were meant to rescue the empire. The Edict of Gülhane, 1839, promised security of life and property. The Islahat Edict, 1856, gave non-Muslims civil equality. But the reforms were too little, too late. Conservatives saw betrayal, nationalists saw an empire admitting its own failure, and corruption devoured what progress was made. When Russia invaded Ottoman lands in 1853, the empire stood on the edge of collapse, but Europe, fearing Russian expansion, came to the rescue. Britain and France allied with the Ottomans. The war was brutal. Disease killed more than bullets, but in the end, Russia was defeated. The Treaty of Paris, 1856, reaffirmed Ottoman sovereignty, but behind the paper victory lay a bitter truth. The Ottomans had won only with foreign blood. War is costly, and reform costs even more. The empire borrowed heavily from London, Paris, Vienna. By 1875, the Ottoman government defaulted on its debt. Chaos followed. European creditors seized control of customs, railways, and taxes. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, staffed by Europeans, now controlled the Sultan's treasury. It was economic colonization, done with ink, not invasion. In 1876, Bulgaria rose in revolt. The Ottoman crackdown was savage. Entire villages burned. The West exploded in outrage. Russia, claiming to defend Slavs and Orthodox Christians, declared war. The Ottomans fought fiercely but were overwhelmed. Plevna, Shipka, Sofia all fell. The war ended in defeat and humiliation. The Treaty of San Stefano, 1878, nearly carved the Balkans away. Britain and Austria intervened to moderate the outcome at the Congress of Berlin, but by then the damage was done. The empire had lost Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia was handed to Austria. As the empire weakened, a new class of intellectuals emerged, the young Ottomans. They demanded liberty, constitutionalism, and parliamentary rule. Exiled in Europe, they printed newspapers, wrote essays, smuggled ideas. They admired France's republic, Britain's balance of power, and Islam's moral core. In 1876, their ideas triumphed, briefly. Sultan Abdul Hamid II accepted a constitution and parliament. But after just 2 years, he dissolved parliament, abolished the constitution, and ruled as an absolute monarch. Hope faded again. Reformers went underground, but their fire would return. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was an empire in name only. It had lost land, power, prestige, and belief. Europe circled like vultures. Its own people no longer trusted it. Its economy was owned by foreigners. Its armies were outdated. Its leaders isolated. But this was not yet the end. That would come with the Great War, the Arab Revolt, and the final abolition of the Caliphate. The sick man still breathed, but every breath was borrowed. The Great War began with honor, allies, and ambition, but for the Ottoman Empire, it would end in betrayal, rebellion, and obliteration. In 4 years, an empire that had lasted 6 centuries would be dismembered by war, lies, and the very people it once ruled. This is the story of the final days, of sultans overthrown, provinces lost, and the empire carved apart on paper and in blood. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined World War I, but not out of strength. The empire had been courted by both sides. But it was Germany that offered weapons, modernization, and promises of protection. Under the influence of the 3 pashas, Enver, Talat, and Shamal, the empire threw its lot with the Central Powers. It was a fatal mistake. The Ottoman declaration of jihad against the Allies shocked the world, but most Muslims ignored the call. What followed was a disaster of military planning and national suicide. 1915 brought 2 brutal campaigns. In the east, Enver Pasha sent Ottoman troops into the frozen Caucasus Mountains to attack Russia. His arrogance cost 90,000 men, most frozen or starved to death. In the west, the Allies invaded the Gallipoli Peninsula, hoping to knock the Ottomans out of the war. Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, emerged a hero, leading the defense that pushed back the British and Anzac forces. Gallipoli was a rare Ottoman victory, earned in blood and mud. In 1915, amid paranoia and fear, the Ottoman government targeted its own citizens. The Christian Armenians, accused of collaborating with Russia, became victims of one of history's greatest atrocities. 1.5 million Armenians were deported, starved, massacred. Entire villages were erased. Caravans of the dying stretched across deserts. It was not just war, it was genocide. A stain that would follow the empire to its grave. In 1916, rebellion broke out in the empire's own heartland, the Arab Revolt. Led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and supported by his sons, Faisal and Abdullah, Arab tribes turned against the empire. Britain saw an opportunity. With the help of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, they armed and funded the revolt. Arab fighters blew up Ottoman railways, attacked supply lines, and captured key cities. In 1917, they took Aqaba. In 1918, they marched into Damascus. The empire's southern provinces were slipping away, not to foreign powers, but to their own people. While Britain promised Arabs independence in exchange for rebellion, a secret betrayal was already underway. In 1916, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing the Middle East between them. Iraq, Syria, Palestine, carved up on maps before the war had even ended. The Balfour Declaration, 1917, promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine, without consulting the Arabs who lived there. By war's end, the Arab world had fought and bled, only to be handed to new masters. The Ottoman military collapsed under the weight of multiple fronts. British forces invaded from Egypt, advancing into Palestine and Syria. In Mesopotamia, Baghdad fell. In the Caucasus, Russia pushed in until the Russian Revolution halted them. In October 1918, the empire signed the Armistice of Mudros. The Ottoman War was over. Its cities were bombed, its economy shattered, its army destroyed. Only the illusion of empire remained. In 1919, Allied forces occupied Istanbul. French soldiers patrolled the streets. British ships sat in the Golden Horn. The Ottoman capital was now under foreign control. In the east, the empire was dissolving. Sultan Mehmed VI, powerless and humiliated, watched as his empire crumbled. In 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI fled on a British warship, the last Ottoman Sultan. 6 centuries of rule ended in silence. The Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, was the final insult. The empire was dismembered. Greece was given Western Anatolia. Italy took the south. France took Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. Armenia was promised land. What was left barely resembled a country. The Ottomans were allowed to exist, on paper, but they no longer ruled themselves. The Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, was the final insult. The empire was dismembered. Greece was given Western Anatolia. Italy took the south. France took Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. Armenia was promised land. What was left barely resembled a country. The Ottomans were allowed to exist, on paper, but they no longer ruled themselves. But in the mountains of Anatolia, a new force was rising. Led by Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, Turkish nationalists rejected the Treaty of Sèvres. They fought the Turkish War of Independence. By 1923, they had expelled foreign forces and abolished the caliphate. The Republic of Turkey was born. The Ottoman Empire, the greatest Islamic empire of the early modern world, was dead, its sultans exiled, its lands taken, its legacy divided among nations still at odds today. But its story is more than a fall. It is a warning, a memory, and a ghost. One that still walks in the streets of Istanbul, whispers in the mosques of Damascus, and flickers in the flags of a divided Middle East. Empires do not die quietly. When the Ottomans fell, their ghost scattered across continents. From the ashes rose new nations, some proud, others broken. This is not just the story of what ended, but of what was left behind. A modern Turkey forged in fire, an Arab world fractured and betrayed, and Christian minorities forgotten in the tide of history. In 1923, the world saw a miracle, a nation born not from colonization or diplomacy, but from war and will. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the victorious general of the Turkish War of Independence, became the architect of modern Turkey. He abolished the Ottoman Caliphate. He banned the fez, adopted the Latin alphabet, and separated religion from state. Istanbul was no longer the seat of sultans. Ankara became the new capital, a symbol of Turkish identity. Turkey turned its back on its Ottoman past. Ataturk's reforms were radical, ruthless, and revolutionary. In 1924, Ataturk abolished the Caliphate, the last universal leadership of the Muslim world. For over 1,300 years, the Caliph had been Islam's political symbol. Muslims from India to North Africa mourned the loss. Protests erupted, fatwas were issued. The Khilafat movement in India collapsed in despair. No new caliph rose to replace the Ottoman one. Islam had lost its unifying figure and would never regain it. Turkey modernized rapidly, but it came at a cost. The Ottoman identity, once central to the people, was erased. Ottoman history was removed from textbooks. The Arabic script was replaced, making generations illiterate to their past. Mosques were turned into museums. Religious courts were dismantled. The call to prayer was even translated into Turkish, temporarily. For many Turks, the new republic brought freedom, but for others it brought a sense of cultural exile. The Ottoman legacy became a political battleground between those who wanted to forget and those who refused to. The Ottoman Empire once held together a diverse Arab world. After its fall, that world was sliced apart by European hands. The Sykes-Picot Agreement carved the Middle East into mandates. Iraq and Palestine went to Britain, Syria and Lebanon to France. The Arabs who had fought for independence were betrayed. In Iraq, a Hashemite king was installed. In Syria, the French crushed a nationalist uprising in Damascus. Borders were drawn with rulers and compasses, ignoring tribes, languages, and history. The result? Decades of civil war, military coups, and foreign intervention. One of the Ottoman Empire's most delicate regions was Palestine. Under Ottoman rule, Muslims, Christians, and Jews had coexisted, uneasily but peacefully. In 1917, the British promised a Jewish homeland in the Balfour Declaration, and Hashemite king would be in period. Kailin, Jewish immigration surged. Arab resistance grew. The Ottomans had left a plural society, but under the British that balance collapsed. The seeds of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, still burning today, were planted in these years of broken promises. The Ottoman Empire had once been a multi-religious state. Its Christians, Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, had lived under Muslim rule for centuries. But war and nationalism turned neighbor against neighbor. The Armenian genocide killed 1.5 million. The Greek population was expelled from Anatolia in a population exchange. Assyrians were massacred in the chaos of World War I. Entire communities vanished. Churches were destroyed or converted. Millions went into exile, their homelands lost forever. Today, the Christian legacy of the Ottoman East is a memory in stone, ruins, cemeteries, and faded icons. The fall of the Ottoman Empire created modern borders, but not modern peace. In Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine, conflict still rages. Ethnic and sectarian tensions, once managed by imperial tolerance, now explode into civil wars. In Turkey, debates rage over Islam, identity, and memory. Is it a Western republic or the heir to a forgotten caliphate? In Europe, the Ottoman ghost is invoked in politics, feared, misunderstood, mythologized. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but it is not forgotten. It echoes in mosques from Bosnia to Baghdad, in recipes, languages, architecture, and wounds. It reminds us that empire is not just conquest. It is memory, culture, sorrow, and inheritance. For some, it was tyranny. For others, unity. For many, it was the only home they had ever known. From Turkey to Tunisia, Jerusalem to Sarajevo, the legacy of the Ottomans lives on, in shadows, in songs, in stories we are still learning how to tell. This is Dead Kings and Lost Nations. Subscribe, for the past may be gone, but it never truly dies. Empires vanish, but they do not die. They leave ghosts, in the stones of cities, in the flags of nations, in the rage of the forgotten. The Ottomans may be gone, but their shadow still stretches across borders, religions, and ideas, and if we listen closely, we can still hear the echo of the sultans in today's world. The borders we see today in the Middle East are not ancient. They were drawn by men in European offices, Sykes and Picot, dividing Ottoman provinces like spoils of war. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, all were once part of a single administrative world, an empire of governors and local rulers. Now those lines bleed. Wars in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine stem not only from politics, but from the collapse of an imperial system that once held diversity in balance. When Ataturk abolished the caliphate in 1924, he did not just end a political office, he ended a symbol of global unity for Muslims. For centuries, Muslims from Morocco to Malaysia saw Istanbul as the heart of the Islamic world. Today that unity is gone. In its place, fragmentation. Radical groups try to revive a false caliphate. Governments compete over who speaks for Islam. The Ottoman Caliphate was flawed, but it was real. Now that spiritual vacuum fuels confusion, and in some corners, violence. The Ottoman Empire was no paradise, but it held a mosaic of faiths in pragmatic peace. Greek Orthodox bishops, Armenian patriarchs, Jewish rabbis, all coexisted under Ottoman law. Today, their descendants live in exile or as tiny minorities in lands their ancestors helped build. From Istanbul's Greek churches to Aleppo's Christian quarters, the ghosts of coexistence haunt the ruins, and the silence of bells once rung now echoes the price of forgotten tolerance. The Ottomans fell in part because of nationalism. Serbs, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs all wanted their own voice. But the empires that replaced them learned nationalism can unite, but also destroy. In the Balkans, Ottoman exit gave way to ethnic cleansing and war. In the Middle East, artificial states struggled to define identity. The dream of freedom became a tangle of ideology, faith, and blood. Today, the world debates identity louder than ever, yet forgets the empire that once managed it with fragile compromise. In modern Turkey, the Ottoman past has returned, not in government, but in narrative. Recep Tayyip Erdogan invokes Ottoman glory. Mosques rise in neo-imperial style. TV shows celebrate sultans as national heroes. Turkey once buried the empire. Now it wears it like a badge, selectively, strategically. This is not a return to empire, but it is a return to the idea of empire, a reminder that ghosts, when fed, do not rest. The legacy of empire is not just seen, it is felt. In trauma passed down, in languages lost, in foods that still carry Ottoman names. To Armenians, the Ottoman past is a genocide. To Serbs, a centuries-long occupation. To Turks, a time of glory and pain. No empire dies cleanly. What remains are myths, fears, and longing. Some want the empire back. Others want its memory erased. Most live in between, haunted by history, whether they know it or not. We think empires are history, but they are today. In the conflict over Jerusalem, in the war in Syria, in the fear of migrants, in the rise of nationalism. We are still dealing with the world the Ottomans left behind. The empire that ruled for 600 years is gone, but the lines it drew, the peoples it housed, the wars it fought, still shape our headlines. Perhaps that is empire's greatest power, not the armies or the palaces, but the legacy no one can bury. This is Dead Kings and Lost Nations, where forgotten empires speak again. Subscribe and never miss the echoes of history that still shape our world today. Subscribe, and remember, what dies in history lives on in us.